In 1880, deep within Kentucky's remote Cumberland Plateau, the Cannon family ruled a hidden compound in Lonesome Holler, 15 miles from civilization and shrouded by forest. Led by the fanatical patriarch Silas Cannon, they practiced ritualized incest to preserve a holy bloodline, while travelers who wandered too close vanished without a trace. For 20 years, no one dared ask why. Then 16-year-old Leah Cannon escaped, exposing horrors buried beneath their smokehouse floor. What monstrous faith justified their acts? How did a whole community overlook the missing? The truth behind Lonesome Holler would shake Appalachia and redefine evil itself. Subscribe to stand with us as we uncover the stories history tried to bury, and comment below with your city and local time. We want to know where these documented accounts reach. The year was 1878, and the Cumberland Plateau of eastern Kentucky existed as a world unto itself, a landscape so rugged and inaccessible that entire valleys could remain hidden from the maps being drawn in distant state capitals. This was post-Reconstruction America, a time when the federal government's attention had turned away from the South, leaving the mountain regions to govern themselves according to customs that stretched back generations. In these hollows, the concept of law enforcement was abstract at best. A county sheriff might cover territory spanning hundreds of square miles of nearly impassable terrain, and his jurisdiction ended where the next ridge began. The people who inhabited these remote valleys were the descendants of Scots-Irish settlers who had pushed into the Appalachian wilderness a century before, seeking land and freedom from authority. They had developed a fierce independence born of necessity, a culture that valued self-sufficiency above all else and viewed outsiders with profound suspicion. In a place where survival demanded every ounce of a family's labor, where a failed harvest could mean starvation, and where the nearest doctor might be a 3-day journey away, communities learned to solve their own problems and keep their own counsel. It was into this isolated world that the Cannon family arrived sometime around 1870, settling in a place the few scattered neighbors came to call Lonesome Holler. The hollow itself was a geographical anomaly, a narrow valley carved by a cold creek that ran between two towering ridges covered in old-growth forest, so dense that sunlight rarely reached the valley floor. There was only one practical route in or out, a treacherous path that required fording the creek multiple times and navigating slopes that could break a horse's leg. The land had been considered worthless by earlier settlers, too steep for farming and too remote for logging, which meant it could be claimed for almost nothing by anyone willing to endure its challenges. Silas Cannon, a man in his late 30s with a commanding presence and a voice trained in Scripture, arrived with his wife, 3 sons, and 2 daughters. He told the few neighbors he encountered that he was seeking a place to worship God without the corruptions of modern society, a place where his family could live according to biblical law. In an era when religious fervor was common and eccentric sects dotted the American landscape, this explanation seemed unremarkable. The Cannons set to work with impressive determination. They built a substantial compound on a relatively flat piece of ground near the creek, a main dwelling constructed of hewn logs, several outbuildings including a smokehouse and root cellar, and a perimeter fence that seemed more suited to defense than keeping livestock contained. They cleared just enough land for a garden and kept a small number of animals. On the rare occasions when Silas or his eldest sons appeared in the distant settlements to trade for salt, powder, or tools, they were polite but distant, completing their business quickly and offering no information about their lives in the hollow. The mountain code of respecting privacy meant that no one pressed them with questions. They were strange, certainly, but strangeness was not a crime. And in a region where every family had its own peculiar ways, the Canaans were simply given a wide berth. The first disappearance occurred in the autumn of 1878. Jacob Hartley was a traveling merchant, a man of about 40 who made his living moving between isolated communities with a pack mule laden with goods, fabric, needles, tobacco, patent medicines, and other small luxuries that mountain families couldn't produce themselves. Hartley was known along his circuit as reliable and fair in his dealings, and he followed the same routes season after season. In late October, he set out on a path that would take him past several homesteads and, according to his usual pattern, near the trails that led toward Lonesome Holler. He never arrived at his next scheduled stop. When inquiries were eventually made, the assumption was simple and logical. Hartley had been robbed and killed by outlaws, his body and goods hidden somewhere in the vast wilderness. Such things happened. The mountains were home to men who lived outside the law, distillers of illegal whiskey who would kill to protect their operations, and drifters who would murder for a few dollars. Without a body, without witnesses, and without any clear place to even begin searching the thousands of acres of untracked forest, there was no investigation to speak of. Jacob Hartley was noted as missing in a ledger at the county seat, and life continued. 20 years passed, and the pattern of disappearances continued in silence. By 1898, when Beau Suttree accepted the appointment as county sheriff, at least a dozen men had vanished in the region surrounding Lonesome Holler. Each disappearance had been treated as an isolated incident, a robbery gone wrong, an accident in the wilderness, or simply a man who had decided to move on without telling anyone. In an era before centralized record-keeping, before telephone lines connected remote outposts, and before the concept of coordinated law enforcement existed in any meaningful way, these individual tragedies remained unconnected in the minds of those who knew about them. The victims were transients, men whose work required them to move through dangerous country, and their absence was noted but not deeply mourned by communities they had only passed through. This was the harsh arithmetic of frontier justice. Some lives were simply too peripheral, too disconnected from settled society to warrant sustained attention when they disappeared. Beau Suttree was not a mountain man. He had come to Kentucky from Virginia, where he had served as a U.S. Marshal tracking fugitives through the Shenandoah Valley. At 48 years old, he possessed the weathered patience of a man who understood that most investigations were won not through dramatic confrontations, but through the slow accumulation of details others had overlooked. He was methodical by nature, keeping meticulous notes and maintaining files that previous sheriffs had neglected. His outsider status worked against him in some ways. The mountain people viewed him with the same suspicion they viewed all representatives of distant authority, but it also freed him from the local customs of non-interference that had allowed so many questions to go unasked. When a federal revenue agent named Thomas Brennan disappeared in the summer of 1902 while investigating illegal distilling operations in the Cumberland Plateau, it became Suttree's case. Revenue agents were not nameless drifters. They were federal employees whose disappearance would demand answers from Washington, and Suttree knew that his ability to do his job depended on solving this one. He began where all investigations must begin, with what was known. Brennan had last been seen in a settlement called Harlan, where he had asked directions to several hollows rumored to contain stills. He had been traveling alone, as was common for agents who relied on surprise and speed rather than force. His horse had been found 3 days later, wandering riderless along a creek bed 20 miles from where he was last seen. The saddlebags were gone, along with Brennan's notebook, weapon, and badge. Suttree spent weeks retracing the agent's likely routes, interviewing the scattered families who lived in the region. He encountered the same wall of silence he had come to expect. Mountain folk did not inform on their neighbors, especially not to federal agents hunting for stills that represented the only source of cash income for many families. Even those who had no love for the moonshiners understood that cooperation with authority was a betrayal of the unwritten codes that governed their world. It was during this frustrating canvassing that Suttree began to notice something that had escaped his predecessors. In the cramped office at the county seat, he had inherited boxes of old reports and correspondence dating back decades. Most sheriffs treated these papers as useless clutter, but Suttree had the mind of an archivist. On sleepless nights, he began reading through the accumulated records of missing persons, unsolved robberies, and unexplained deaths. What emerged from these yellowing pages was not proof, but a suggestion, a geographic pattern so faint it could easily be dismissed as coincidence. Over the past 25 years, at least 11 men had been reported missing after heading into or near the remote valleys on the eastern edge of the county. The descriptions varied: a peddler in 1878, a timber prospector in 1881, another peddler in 1883, a wandering preacher in 1887, two prospectors in 1889, a horse trader in 1892, a census taker in 1894, and others whose records were incomplete. When Suttree marked their last known locations on a map, the marks clustered around the approaches to several deep hollows, the most remote of which was Lonesome Holler, where the Connon family maintained their isolated compound. Suspicion was not evidence, and Suttree knew that approaching a family as isolated and defensive as the Connons without legal grounds would accomplish nothing except alerting them to his interest. He made the journey to Lonesome Holler in the early autumn of 1902, riding alone with the stated purpose of introducing himself as the new sheriff and asking if the family had seen any strangers passing through their land. The ride took most of a day, following trails that grew increasingly narrow and overgrown until he reached the final approach to the compound. What struck him first was the deliberate positioning of the homestead. It sat in the only clear sightline in the entire valley, meaning anyone approaching could be observed long before they arrived. The fence that surrounded the property was built higher and stronger than any livestock enclosure required, with sharpened posts angled outward. As Suttree rode into the clearing, he counted at least 6 figures watching him from various positions around the compound, men and older boys, all armed, all silent. Silas Cannon emerged from the main house to greet him. The patriarch was in his early 60s by then, a tall man with a long gray beard and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the people he addressed. His voice carried the practiced cadence of a preacher, formal and archaic in its phrasing. He welcomed Suttree with elaborate courtesy, offering him water and asking after his journey, but beneath the politeness was an unmistakable warning. When Suttree asked if anyone in the family had encountered a federal agent in recent months, Silas responded that they had no dealings with outsiders and no knowledge of any man's movements beyond their own land. He spoke of the family's devotion to God and their desire to live according to biblical law, unmolested by the concerns of the corrupted world. Throughout the conversation, Silas never invited Suttree inside any of the buildings, and the armed men positioned around the property never lowered their weapons. After less than an hour, Suttree understood that he had learned all he would learn from a direct approach. He thanked Silas for his time and rode back towards civilization with the distinct feeling that he had just been politely but firmly warned away from ever returning. The case went cold through the winter of 1902 and into the spring of 1903. Sutri had his suspicions, but nothing actionable, and the demands of his office pulled him toward cases where evidence actually existed. Then, in late April of 1903, a half-starved girl was found collapsed on a trail 15 miles from Lonesome Holler. She was brought to the county seat more dead than alive, suffering from exposure, malnutrition, and injuries consistent with a desperate flight through wilderness. The town doctor initially believed she was simple-minded, as her speech seemed incoherent, and her grasp of basic concepts appeared limited. She spoke in a strange mixture of biblical phrases and invented terms, referring to people as either the pure or the serpent seed, and describing a place she called the cleansing pit, where the unclean ones were given to the earth. She claimed her name was Leah, and that she had escaped from her grandfather Silas because he intended to give her in marriage to her uncle in a ceremony he called the binding of blood. When Sheriff Sutry heard that a girl had appeared claiming to be from the Cannon family, he went immediately to speak with her. What he found was a 16-year-old girl who had known nothing in her life except the compound in Lonesome Holler. She had never learned to read, had never seen a town, and had no framework for understanding the world beyond the doctrines her grandfather had drilled into every member of the family since birth. To Leah, the outside world was populated by corrupted souls who would pollute the pure bloodline that Silas claimed descended directly from a lost tribe of Israel. She had been taught that marriage between close family members was not just acceptable, but holy, the only way to preserve their divine heritage. She had watched her older sisters given to uncles and cousins in ritualistic ceremonies, had seen the children born from these unions, many with physical deformities that Silas proclaimed were marks of God's favor rather than the consequences of genetic catastrophe. Sutry spent weeks gaining Leah's trust, visiting her daily in the room where she was being cared for by a local minister's wife. He understood that this traumatized girl, shaped entirely by her grandfather's fanaticism, had no reason to trust him or any representative of the outside world she had been taught to fear. He spoke to her gently, never pressing too hard, allowing her to tell her story in fragments that slowly formed a coherent and horrifying picture. She described how outsiders who came near the compound were watched and evaluated by Silas and his sons. Those who carried goods or money, who seemed unlikely to be missed, were sometimes invited to shelter for the night or offered assistance with their travels. These men never left Lonesome Holler. Leah had not witnessed the killings herself. The women and younger children were kept away during what Silas called the Lord's work of cleansing. But she had seen the aftermath. She described a hidden smokehouse where her grandfather kept a locked chest, and she had once glimpsed inside it when her uncle retrieved something Silas needed. Inside were objects she did not understand at the time: metal badges, pocket watches, spectacles, papers with official seals, and other personal effects that had belonged to the murdered men. This testimony, delivered in Leah's halting voice, still thick with her grandfather's religious rhetoric, gave Sutry what he needed: probable cause. He took her statements to the circuit judge and obtained a warrant to search the Cannon property for evidence related to the disappearance of federal agent Thomas Brennan and other missing persons. Sutry knew that executing this warrant would be extraordinarily dangerous. The Cannon compound was a fortress occupied by armed men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill, and Silas Cannon was a zealot who believed himself divinely protected. Suttree assembled a posse of 12 deputies from 3 surrounding counties, carefully selecting men he knew to be steady under pressure. He warned them that they might be riding into an ambush and that they should prepare for the worst. In late May of 1903, the posse rode toward Lonesome Holler, taking 2 full days to position themselves around the valley to prevent any escape. The confrontation, when it came, was tense and strange. The Conan men did not open fire, as Suttree had feared, but neither did they immediately surrender. Silas emerged from the main house as the posse closed in, and he began to preach. Standing in the center of his compound, with his sons and grandsons arrayed behind him, he delivered a sermon about persecution, about the righteous being tested by the armies of the wicked, about how God would strike down those who dared interfere with his chosen people. For nearly an hour he spoke without pause, his voice rising and falling in practiced rhythms, clearly convinced that his words alone would turn the lawmen away, or that divine intervention would manifest on his behalf. Suttree, who had heard many desperate men invoke God's protection in the moments before their arrest, waited patiently for the sermon to end. When it finally did, when Silas stood silent and expectant, waiting for the miracle that did not come, Suttree stated simply that he had a legal warrant and that the family would submit to a search or face immediate arrest for obstruction. The fight drained out of Silas visibly in that moment, as if he suddenly understood that his God would not save him. He ordered his sons to lay down their weapons, and the family was placed under guard while the search began. The deputies started with the main house, finding conditions that shocked even these hardened men. The dwelling was filthy and poorly maintained despite years of occupation, and several of the younger children showed obvious signs of severe inbreeding, developmental disabilities, physical deformities, and a fearful broken quality that spoke to systematic abuse. But it was in the smokehouse, exactly where Leah had described, that they found the evidence that would seal the case. Beneath the floorboards was a dry cellar, and in that cellar was a wooden chest. Inside were the personal effects of more than 20 men, pocket watches with inscriptions, government identification papers, peddler's licenses, a revenue agent's badge, spectacles, wedding rings, and other items that could be traced to specific individuals who had disappeared over the past quarter century. The discovery of the chest led immediately to a more grim search of the surrounding property. Leah had spoken of a field beyond the compound where the family buried what she called the remnants of the cleansing, and the deputies began a systematic excavation that would continue for 3 days. What they unearthed confirmed the worst of Leah's testimony. In shallow graves scattered across an area of nearly 2 acres, they found the remains of at least 28 individuals, some so degraded by time and the acidic mountain soil that identification would prove impossible. Others retained enough physical evidence, clothing fragments, personal items buried with the bodies, to match them to the missing persons reports Suttree had painstakingly compiled. The men who performed this excavation, hardened by years of frontier violence, were visibly shaken by the scale of what they uncovered. This was not the work of desperate outlaws or a single murderous rampage. This was systematic, sustained killing carried out over more than 2 decades by an entire family operating under the delusional certainty that they were doing God's work. Silas Cannon and his 5 eldest sons and grandsons were transported under heavy guard to the state capitol, where they would stand trial for multiple counts of murder. The trial, which began in October of 1903, became a national sensation. Newspapers across the country sent correspondents to cover what they dubbed the Canaanites of Kentucky, a play on Silas's surname, and the biblical first murderer. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators drawn by morbid curiosity and the promise of hearing directly from a man who had orchestrated one of the most extensive family-based killing sprees in American history. The prosecution presented the physical evidence methodically, the victim's belongings, the testimony of Sheriff Suttree describing the excavation of the graves, and most powerfully, the testimony of Leah Cannon herself. She sat in the witness box, still fragile and clearly terrified, and described in her halting voice the life she had known inside the compound, the forced marriages between close relatives, the children born with deformities that her grandfather claimed were divine marks, and the disappearances of outsiders that the family never discussed but everyone understood. The defense attempted to argue that Silas was insane, that his religious delusions absolved him of criminal responsibility, but this strategy collapsed when Silas himself took the stand. The patriarch had been largely silent since his arrest, but in the courtroom he found his pulpit again. For nearly 2 days he testified in his own defense, and his words revealed a mind that was not divorced from reality, but rather had constructed an alternative reality, so complete and self-justifying that ordinary morality could not penetrate it. He spoke of his divine mission to preserve a pure bloodline descended from a lost tribe that only he had the wisdom to identify. He described the incestuous unions he had arranged not as crimes, but as sacred duty, the fulfillment of God's command to keep the blood undefiled. When questioned about the murders, he did not deny them. Instead, he explained with chilling calmness that outsiders represented a contaminating influence, agents of the serpent sent to tempt his family away from righteousness. Their deaths were not murders, but acts of holy cleansing, no different from the commandments given to the Israelites to destroy the corrupted peoples of Canaan. He had taken their possessions not as theft, but as the righteous claiming of spoils from the enemies of God. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Silas Cannon and his 4 eldest sons were found guilty on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. The younger family members, including several grandsons who had participated in the killings but were deemed to have been so thoroughly indoctrinated from birth that they could not be held fully responsible, were remanded to state asylums and work farms. The executions were carried out in January of 1904. According to witnesses, Silas mounted the gallows still preaching, still utterly convinced that his God would intervene at the final moment to vindicate him and strike down his persecutors. No such intervention came. The 5 men were hanged, and their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the prison cemetery.